The Denver Broncos are moving on from veteran wide receiver Tim Patrick. We'll tell you here on today's episode show why we think that is a massive gamble here by Broncos head coach Sean Payton. You're going to get that and much more all on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Special shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for making us your first listen, however you watch or engage with the show, whether that's on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe or follow so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team, the Denver Broncos, every single day, all year long. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined as always by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at Predominantly Orange. And look, on today's episode of the show, as the roster cut down deadline is getting closer, things are heating up, and the Denver Broncos have decided to take a little bit of a bold approach here and truly embracing the youth movement. Sean Payton has fully embraced that from the onset, and now some roster moves dictate that going into today's deadline. What does the Broncos wide receiver room look like without Tim Patrick? And that's really going to be the biggest story of today's episode. Shows the team is planning on moving away from him, whether that's via trade or if they can't find a trade partner by the 2 p.m. Mountain Time deadline, they will find a way to release him. What does this look like? How does this impact the state of the Broncos roster? Sayre, we're going to break that all down here on today's episode show, which is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Look, and when people start watching NFL Sunday Ticket, Tim Patrick won't be in the Denver Broncos uniform. All signs point to that.
Yeah, it's crazy to think, right? Because we just saw him have a great game against the Green Bay Packers. And I know the analogy has come up a couple times, like who could be this year's Albert Okwuegbunam, right? Who was kind of showcased in the preseason finale last year and then traded to the Philadelphia Eagles. Little did we know that it might be Tim Patrick, right? I mean, it's kind of wild to think about. It felt like all along, Sean Payton, the Broncos, getting that renewed contract done with Tim Patrick early in the offseason. It just felt as though, man, if he stayed healthy, he's going to be an asset to this team in some way, shape, or form. I didn't expect it to be in terms of bringing back more draft capital for the old war chest for George Payton, right? And so it's definitely going to be bittersweet, Cody. If the Broncos can trade Tim Patrick, we'll feel a lot better about it. But in terms of what he leaves behind, I think that's kind of our point of discussion today, and especially our emphasis for as we open up the show. Like, is this too big of a risk for the Denver Broncos to be taking right now?
I feel like it is a little bit of a gamble here for Sean Payton. And look, I like the confidence that Sean has in the team's youth, and certainly with some of these receivers, which we'll talk about here in a minute. There are some promising signs about the direction this team can head with some of these players. But for me, the reason I believe this is a big gamble here for Payton, you look at the last couple of weeks, I feel like throughout training camp, Bo Nix has developed a lot of chemistry here with Tim Patrick. Specifically, you saw that comfort level in joint practices against the Green Bay Packers. Then he goes out against the Green Bay Packers in the preseason game just 2 weeks ago, 4 catches, 30 yards, and a touchdown. Everyone's welcoming Tim back to the mix. Like, you see the chemistry there. And look, I think for a rookie quarterback like Bo Nix, don't get me wrong, Courtland Sutton, he's going to get his, right? But you and I have talked about, okay, hey, if teams allocate their coverage resources towards Courtland's side, makes you feel good that you have a guy like Tim Patrick who's looking good. It makes you feel good that you have Josh Reynolds in the mix. Well, now you remove Tim Patrick from that equation. And certainly this is a little bit of a gamble here for the Broncos, considering the fact that I felt like Tim Patrick could have been a great young security blanket asset for a rookie quarterback like Bo Nix. I think you have to have good wide receiver depth. I think that Denver will. I just didn't see it being without Tim Patrick.
I didn't either. And I think obviously Sean Payton really likes guys like Brandon Johnson, Lil Jordan Humphrey, and David Sills. And we'll talk more about them coming up, but those guys had some good moments in the preseason as well. And we saw finally Troy Franklin coming on. But as far as the shock factor of Tim Patrick being released, Cody, I think we have to talk about the fact that, man, there was the emergence offseason of Devon Vele. Like, did Devon Vele steal this roster spot? I mean, this is kind of what I feel like. And I mean, we throw around comparisons all the time because Sean Payton has a huge library of history here. But is Devon Vele this year's version of his, Marcus Colston from years past in New Orleans, right? Marcus Colston, a 7th round pick, kind of just thought to be a big body receiver. You don't really put too much stock into that. And with Devon Vele, I mean, it's kind of the same type of deal, right? It's like, wow, he's too old, or it didn't have an elite RAS score, or whatever the case may be. And it's hard to find a spot for him in this wide receiver room. And you certainly don't think that Tim Patrick is going to be the one that gets sacrificed on the roster to make room for a guy like this. But maybe Devon is going to play a much bigger role this coming season. So there's a lot of things at play here. Of course, the sentiment and the attachment of the fan base with Tim Patrick. We all love Tim Patrick. We've all been rooting for him. We haven't got to see him play in the last handful of years. I don't know who to give credit to for this, Cody, but it's like the offensive version of Bradley Chubb and Von Miller. It's a duo that we dreamed of with Tim Patrick and Courtland Sutton that we never got to really see on the field after those guys signed their new contracts. So it's tough. It's a brutal bit of news as far as what we thought was going to happen. We just did a bunch of roster projections just a couple hours ago, right? And now we're having to kind of reshuffle the deck here. It's tough to see Tim Patrick go, but you love that this team is committed to this youth movement.
Yeah, and look, Vele's emergence definitely has something to do with it. I mean, he's been playing inside the slot, can play on the outside. He is a big body guy, but he's a leaner frame, right? He's an athletic guy. And I'd say, like, when you look at Tim's smart. I think how he played against the Green Bay Packers, you saw it against zone coverage. He always made the smart decisions. He did exactly what he was supposed to do there. And it's like Devon Vele. Yeah, he's 26, 27 years old. He's in that time frame. He's a rookie, though. Yeah, and he has all this upside to him. He's making the contested jump ball situations like consistently in practice. You love that, right? And my whole thing is, okay, with this news, who is wide receiver 2 here for the Broncos? Cortland is obviously wide receiver 1. Does that now become Josh Reynolds? Does it become Marvin Mims? I have my thoughts on Mims and really why I think this move is a bigger gamble. We'll talk about with some of the other wide receivers in that room, but who do you think is wide receiver 2 now in this Broncos receiver room? Like, is it a wide receiver? Is it a tight end at this point? I'm curious for your thoughts here, Sayre.
Well, I think it's got to be Marvin Mims right off the top of my head, Cody, because Marvin, his involvement this offseason has been super weird. I mean, I don't know where to go with this. Like, could the Broncos be cooking up another trade to bring somebody else in? I doubt to be wide receiver 2, right? Unless we're talking about Brandon Ayuk, which would make Courtland Sutton wide receiver 2, right? So it's not like we can just tell, okay, you look at these pieces that are in place and what we've seen this offseason, like it's very clear that this guy is number 2. I think that's part of the issue right now is like you're saying, it's super unclear. I mean, Josh Reynolds, is he a number 2 wide receiver in the NFL? I think he was like the number 4 or number 5 guy in the overall offense at target share in Detroit last year. So it's going to be interesting to see because Sean Payton, he's obviously cooking something up. What is it? I don't know that it's as dramatic as another trade here, but is it somebody from within that we're maybe not expecting to take on as big of a role?
Well, and that's something we'll obviously lead into here coming up on today's episode of Locked On Broncos because the wide receiver room, we have an idea what it looks like initially set in stone with 5 players. Seems like there could be a 6th option here, and that is something that I think our good friend Mike Kliss kind of pinpointed. There's a list of 3 wide receivers whose names got mentioned specifically. One of these 3 will be on the active roster, according to Kliss. We'll break it down, and I'll share some insight as to why I don't think Marvin Mims is wide receiver 2 just yet. You'll get that here on today's episode. Locked On Broncos.
There's a trio of receivers that could be vying for the final wide receiver spot on the Denver Broncos roster, and maybe Marvin Mims not wide receiver 2 even after Tim Patrick being potentially cut or released here in the coming hours. Cody and I breaking it down on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, and want to thank each and every one of you for making us your first listen of the day every single day. You know your boys are going to be here for you, covering all things Denver Broncos, whether it's roster cuts, game reactions, injuries, anything that may come up with this team. We got you covered every single day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And for your second listen, go ahead, check out Locked On NFL and find out what else is going on around the league as teams are making cuts, trades, and moves. And you want to be up to date on all things going on there. So the wide receiver position changing pretty dramatically from what I think you and I anticipated. We covered, remember when Mike Kliss reported 2 weeks ago ish that Tim Patrick was potentially on the roster bubble? You and I discussed that, Cody, and the possibility of that. Dealing with the reality of it now, though, is a little different. I think now we're forced with real decisions and real, like, okay, who is wide receiver 2? Who are the 6 guys that this team wants to keep? Kliss gave us some insight into that now as well.
Yeah, and look, I think when you look at this roster, Cortland Sutton, Josh Reynolds, Marvin Mims, Devon Vele, Troy Franklin, all expected to make the 53-man roster. But Kliss put out an interesting note about, hey, there are one of 3 players who could potentially land on the 53 as well because of their contributions on special teams. There's Brandon Johnson mentioned there, Lil Jordan Humphrey, and David Sills. Now, this makes things very, very interesting because there was no Jalen Virgil on that list. So part of me is wondering, okay, hey, what is the plan here with Virgil? Are they really trying to bring him back onto the practice squad? Well, if it's one of those 3 players between Johnson, Sills, and Lil Jordan Humphrey, I mean, Sayre, in your opinion, who makes the most sense? Like, if I'm looking at it from the standpoint, okay, if you need guys to play on special teams, I think that's David Sills and Lil Jordan Humphrey primarily. I think Brandon Johnson can do some stuff for you on special teams, but if you're looking for a guy who could be a playmaker, because if we anticipate correctly that we think that Troy Franklin will be kind of a redshirt year this year, will be like a game day inactive, you need one of these guys to play on Sundays, even if they are the 6th wide receiver, not necessarily in the order of the depth chart. Who gives the Broncos the best overall chance in this situation? I think we've seen some growth here from Lil Jordan Humphrey over the last year. I think he's been very, very solid throughout this offseason. And then David Sills has been a guy who impressed me. He's the grinder. He's the blue collar lunch hat. He's got the lunch pail with him, the hard hat, and he's going to work every single day. And I thought he had a great preseason as well in these last couple of games. If you had to decide right now between one of those 3 players, who do you think it would be if you were George Payton or Sean Payton in this situation?
Well, I'm going with the dark horse here because I feel like nobody was really talking about him up until this point. Other than you, Cody, I've heard you mention he's had a number of good practices, but David Sills, I think, is the guy that I'm leaning towards here because it just feels a little too convenient that his name's kind of getting lumped in there. It's not like they're saying all receivers are still up for grabs here for the 6th spot, right? And Jalen Virgil's name was deliberately not mentioned by Kliss. And I think Brandon Johnson has the history of production there. Lil Jordan Humphrey has history with Sean Payton. But to me, David Sills is that guy. All right, if he's contributing on special teams, we saw some really good stuff from him in the preseason that kind of went a little overlooked, didn't we? Especially in that last game against Arizona. So to me, that's the guy that I would say just based on a hunch, not necessarily based on, well, obviously Brandon Johnson has more production. Obviously, Lil Jordan Humphrey has more production. All 3 of those guys, as it turns out, have experience learning this offense. They were all here all last year. And I wonder, a year ago at this time, when Sean Payton acquired David Sills from the New York Giants after they cut him, he had a big preseason for the Giants last year, remember? And I wonder what Sean Payton said to him at that time, right? Because Sean likes to pick these little nuggets of like, oh, I said this to this guy to get him to come to Denver. And, and it ended up happening this way. I wonder what's the origin story for David Sills and how much that could come into play here.
Well, I've seen David Sills work like last year, even on the practice squad. Like, this is a guy who's just working on the little details. I think he got a couple of game day elevations to the active roster. But here's also another thing, too. As you were talking about that, it kind of made sense. So after Sunday's game, we're in the post-game locker room. We're interviewing players. PR comes up to us and says, hey, like in a moment, David Sills is going to be at his locker if you want to talk to him. Well, I was like, that's weird because they don't normally do that. Like they'll mention some guys will be available, but not usually guys like David Sills. Usually you could just go up to David and you could talk to David. Obviously, he mentioned a lot about just grinding away and he's confident in his ability to play in the National Football League. And I agree. I think David Sills is a very, very under the radar guy, very athletic background there. I still think you could bring Lil Jordan Humphrey back on the practice squad. I feel like you can make an argument for any of these 3 guys. And I would even say you can make an argument for Jalen Virgil as well. If you wanted to include 4 guys in that mix instead of 3, certainly you could do that. There's the notion, like, did Devon Vele push Tim Patrick off the team? Not necessarily that. I know it was also brought up as, like, could it be potentially a financial issue? a monetary thing why the Broncos moving on from Tim Patrick. To my understanding, that's not the reason why. It is truly a youth movement. But now we also go to the point as well. Let's talk about Troy Franklin here. The Broncos obviously drafted him. He was a high importance player for them, but they couldn't pass up Jonah Ellis at the time. So they got Jonah, and they still found a way to trade up to get Troy Franklin. They got their guys in this year's NFL draft. Troy didn't have necessarily the flashiest, like on field. You don't see it popping up in the statistical categories in terms of preseason production. Part of me also wonders, like, hey, like we all know he's been figured out. He's had a couple of drops during practice, but he also has that flash potential and that flash ability. Are you banking on that this season, or are you saying like, hey, I know that Cortland is going to be this guy. I know Josh Reynolds is going to be this guy. We've seen Devon Bailey be further ahead than most people. That now brings us to Marvin Mims, who I said it earlier, I don't think he's the wide receiver too. Sayre, like we were wondering in the preseason, are the Broncos hiding Marvin Mims? But I go back to all the training camp practices. Marvin had a little bit of a frustrating training camp from an optics perception. Like he wasn't having good practices. He wasn't being really featured as much. Like he would have a couple of catches here and there, but all this talk about Marvin now having a bigger role, you think we would have seen it during training camp. We didn't see it during training camp. To me, that is a concerning reason why I think this is still a gamble here for the Broncos to move on from Timmy P. I want your thoughts on that too, because if Marvin is not where the team needs him to be from a receiving standpoint, that is a little bit of a concern here.
It definitely is. And it's a reason to pump the brakes on Marvin Mims a little bit in 2024. We saw Michael Bandy return most of the punts in the preseason, Cody. I think the Broncos obviously are going to be relying on Marvin to do that on a full-time basis. And the conversation, a lot of this offseason has centered around, well, if Marvin is still returning punts and kicks, like, is he going to be able to be as involved in the offense, right? I think the Broncos may prefer his involvement in special teams at this point in the return game. And like I said earlier, could have egg on my face at the end of the day that he's going to be way more involved in the offense than it seems. But remember, early in the preseason, he was playing pretty deep into that game against Indianapolis. And we're all wondering, like, what does that actually mean right now? Does it mean anything at all? And maybe it does mean something, because they were hiding him as a return man this offseason. I mean, we know what he can do there. He's proven, and they let somebody else have the opportunities because they know that he's going to do that. And so I just think that, man, we're trending towards, could Troy Franklin take on a more expanded role than initially thought? I mean, anything and everything is still on the table here. After you cut somebody like Tim Patrick, it's such a domino effect. It's not like the Broncos just lost CeeDee Lamb off the roster, but Tim Patrick being cut or traded does set off this sort of trickle effect that is going to, the questions are not going to be answered until we get to Seattle. And maybe that's the biggest thing that Sean Payton wanted out of this.
Yeah, and look, I think we've all come to a point that I think Sean Payton has certainly earned the trust to be like, hey, like we may not see the vision on this. We're very curious to see what the vision is for you. And look, if we'll hear from Sean maybe later on Tuesday, following the roster deadline, depending on practice availability. If that is the case, we're still awaiting word on that at this point. I'm very curious to see what the vision is here. I understand he's going to probably mention the words youth movement. For Marvin, it's not like Marvin can't do the things that we expect him to in terms of maybe an amplified role. We just didn't see it early on. It doesn't mean that he can't get there. Or maybe the fact Broncos were hiding him. I don't know if that's going to be the case, though, because in preseason and even in training camp, you need to be out there. You need to be doing the things you're going to be doing in the regular season. So a big mystery right here. We'll obviously follow up with Sean Payton when we get a chance to meet with him after roster cuts to be able to bring some clarity to the situation here. But it wasn't just Tim Patrick who came under the headlines of having some trade interest. The Broncos are also going to be moving on from veteran running back Sayre Bedinger. What might his value on the trade market be? And is this another example of Sean Payton embracing the youth movement? What will the Broncos running back room look like? We'll dive deeper into that and tell you why we're very confident in this choice here on today's episode, Locked on Broncos. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode of the show, Sayre Bedinger, his time in Denver is coming to an end, whether that's via trade or whether that is via release by the 2:00 p.m. Mountain Time deadline. As we're recording this episode of the show, bringing it to all your ears and eyes in Broncos country, to all the everydayers and first listeners, we want to say thanks once again for making the show exactly what it is. we all know Samaje Perine, the writing for him was kind of on the wall here, Sayre, the moment the Broncos drafted Audric Estime. I know initially when that happened, a lot of people said, oh, that may be a move for the Broncos moving on from Javonte Williams. You heard the false speculation and rumors this offseason that Javonte Williams' roster spot was on the line. Come to find out, it never was. And now you've started to see the running back pecking order really kind of define itself here in the last 3 or 4 weeks. Javonte being the number one. You've got Jaleel McLaughlin being the steady, consistent number 2 guy. And then Audric Estime obviously getting an extensive look in the preseason, going out and proving, hey, he can offer you value in the pass protection game. He's underrated out of the backfield as a pass catcher, but he's also a guy that's going to run the ball for you in short yardage situations. You can do a lot of fun stuff with him. So really at that point, unless you're keeping 4 running backs, which doesn't make sense right now overall, the writing has always been on the wall for Samaje Perine, maybe going elsewhere, and a continued youth movement here for Sean Payton.
And maybe that final preseason game from Audric Estime really cemented this. Not that it wasn't kind of a done deal or obvious before, but we saw the full arsenal of Estime's skills against the Arizona Cardinals, didn't we? We saw him as a runner, we saw him as a receiver, and he capped off that drive, which was really all him. You know, it was a featured drive for Estime, and I think we saw, man, the power, the short line or the short yardage ability, the underrated pass catching ability. He offers more in the running game than does Samaje Perine, quite frankly, because last year, remember, Samaje carried the ball 53 total times. It wasn't like this guy was rocking, he wasn't just carrying the rock every single down for the Denver Broncos. He was kind of the 2-minute drill guy in the end of half situation and end of game situation. And he came through in clutch situations. There's no question about it. He provided a spark for the offense. It was really a lot, though, of just Russell Wilson kind of keying in on him and being like, that's my guy that I'm going to. I have to find Samaje wherever I'm at on this play. And he did oftentimes. So I'm not saying Samaje is not a good player. Obviously, he is. He has value around the league. There's lots of teams. We've mentioned this on previous shows. There's lots of teams that have bad running back situations right now, including his former team, the Bengals, including the Dallas Cowboys, off the top of my head, Cody. And so there's going to be a market for Samaje, whether the Broncos trade or cut him. And look, if you can get a couple late round picks for Tim Patrick and Samaje Perine, save some cap space, get your young guys going, I think that's overall a win for Sean Payton and this coaching staff.
Well, and I think the question too is there going to be a team that bites on trading for a running back at this point? And look, the contract valuation has certainly changed, really outside of the exclusions of Josh Jacobs and Saquon Barkley in Philadelphia. The overall perception is, hey, the running back market, it's going to change. It's going to decrease in value because there's a surplus of guys that are available, whether proven or unproven. You look at a guy like Samaje, a team is going to get exactly that. Look, I think the biggest concern around Perine, ball security at times, some plays that lead to turnovers. But man, like you brought it up, without him last season, the Broncos have a worse record than they did. Look, they found a way to win 8 games after starting off 1-5. Perine helped get them into game-winning field goal positioning on certain games. He kept drives alive that set up scoring drives with touchdowns for them out of the backfield, as you mentioned, his connection with Russell Wilson. But at this point, Denver is really embracing a vision and an identity where they are going to pound the rock. They are going to get to what Sean Payton, when he first came in, said, our vision for this offense is to be able to run the football. You get a little bit more out of that, in my opinion, I think, with a healthy Javonte, a dashing Jaleel McLaughlin, and a bulldozer of a guy in Audric Estime with Michael Burton as your fullback. The question here is, what team does seem like the better fit? Like, the more I look at it, you mentioned the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm like, I don't even know who their running back is off the top of my head. And obviously, you could check out the Locked On Bengals podcast if you want more insight as to that situation, or you could check out the Locked On Cowboys podcast to figure that one out. Because if I'm not mistaken, I know Ezekiel Elliott is back in Dallas.
Yep.
But
I think Zach Moss is with the Bengals right now.
Okay, so Zach Mott, yeah, interesting. Like a guy like Perine can help contribute to those teams, which I feel like, or I mean, what does Tennessee's situation look like with Callahan?
Tony
Right
Pollard,
now, I know
yeah,
they have Pollard. Don't they have Tyjae Spears? Isn't he on that
and
roster
Tyjae
as well?
Spears, yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, could they add another guy like
they
Perine?
could.
Certainly possible, but
Yeah, yep.
part
There's
of
lots
me
of
thinks this is going to end up in him being released versus him being traded for. Whereas I think Tim Patrick will actually acquire a draft pick. I think there will be a team that will trade for Tim. P. Ryan, I'm not sure there's going to be a strong enough trade market.
If George Payton can do it though, Cody, I mean,
He
my
can.
gosh, he works the phones like nobody's. And you know what they can leverage right now is interest from multiple teams. Like unless and then you could get teams in trouble for tampering if they're like, no, we know we're going to be able to get Samaje, right? Unless he has a predetermined like, hey, I want to go here. And if the Broncos know that he wants to go somewhere and they find that out, then you can leverage that in trade talks. So I think to me, I do think he'll be able to be traded unless there's no market for him, right? Which doesn't make sense to me right now, given the optics of other teams in the league. Like we've already mentioned a few that need running back help. I just feel like that's a situation where, let's say you're Dallas. Dallas's number 2 running back might be Royce Freeman. I mean, the former Denver Bronco. That's the state of their running back spot right now. Not that Royce isn't a good dude or a good player and having a good camp for them, because he is, but I'm just saying Samaje has big game experience. He catches a lot of passes. He pass protects. There's so much that he brings to the table for a very low price that I would say, man, yeah, if you're a team that thinks you're a contender, go get this guy to help your running back room.
You get a draft pick. You get a draft pick. Everybody gets a draft pick. George Payton will be working the phones. I'm curious to see how this all shapes out. And look, by the time we're recording this episode, it drops for people. Something could have already happened. So if that's the case, disregard that. But obviously some valuable conversation that we've had here on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. Roster deadlines are obviously 2:00 p.m. Mountain Time on Tuesday, where Denver will have to become compliant, have 53 players on the active roster. There's going to be a lot of shuffling this week, regardless of that situation. And you know one thing is for certain, you can rely on your boys, Sayre Bedinger, Cody Roark here. We're going to break it all down on Locked On Broncos every single day. Hey, it's getting real. The Broncos season opener is just around the corner. This is the place to be. So Broncos country, all the everydayers out there, thanks for making us your first listen. Subscribe or follow if you haven't done so already. If you're a brand new viewer or listener of the show, welcome in. We hope this is the type of conversation and discussion that you love as it pertains to your Denver Broncos. We'll have complete recap of the Broncos' final 53-man roster. Anything that's more breaking and pressing that comes out, you'll get that on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.